Right, welcome back. Up here for another video. Today I want to talk with you a little bit about labor markets. And labor markets, of course, are, well, they're markets for workers or markets for workers' time and effort. And labor markets are an example of a broader category that we can refer to here for a second called a factor market. And a factor market is any place where firms go to purchase the factors that they need for production. And there's kind of three broad categories that we divide these factors into. We think about land, or more generally, I guess you can think about raw materials, natural resources, things like that. We think about labor, which is time and effort from workers, and we think about capital. These are fixed items, machines and factories and things like that. And so land, labor, and capital all are part of the production process, and the firm needs to go and collect and purchase these various inputs in factor markets. And there are enough things about labor markets in particular that are interesting and unique that we're going to treat them a little bit separately. But do realize that this discussion applies nearly equally as well to land and to capital markets as well. And so one of the big things that I want to point out is that these labor markets are examples of what's called derived. In these labor markets, there's what's called derived demand. And what this means is that the demand for labor is not in and of itself something that we can measure, but rather that the demand for labor comes from the fact that we have demand for the goods and services that labor produces. And the same thing would hold true for capital and for land as well. So we're going to be talking about the derived demand for labor. It's going to come from firms who are looking to hire workers. And when they hire those workers, they use those workers along with land and capital and other inputs in order to produce goods and services, which they then sell in a goods market. So we have factor markets and we have kind of final goods markets as well. And what we've been talking about, supply and demand and everything up until this point, has had to do with goods markets. So we're going to add in a couple things here as we talk about factor markets. The first is going to be this bit about derived demand, some specific components of that. And then I also want to talk a little bit with you a bit later on about a specific application of a kind of market interference in the labor market, which is the story about the minimum wage. And there's some kind of interesting lessons that we can learn using some of the tools that we've developed in the previous chapters. So let me go ahead and get us a fresh screen and we'll draw a couple of pictures. All right, so the first thing that we are going to take a look at in thinking about labor markets is this idea of derived demand. And again, one of the things that makes labor markets interesting and maybe a little bit potentially confusing is that the role that you and I play, assuming that you are like me, more likely to be a worker than an employer, is kind of reversed from the way we used to think about it with regards to goods markets. So in a goods market or in a services market, if I go out and buy a pizza or I go out and buy a gym membership or something like that, I'm the consumer, and part of my behavior or my behavior is captured in part by the demand curve for pizza, for example. I don't really have much to do with the supply side of that market unless I happen to own a pizzeria. On the labor side, however, my main interaction as a sort of run-of-the-mill everyday worker and consumer, my main interaction with the labor market is in the form of a supplier, not in the form of a demander. So that's kind of the biggest change, I guess, is that in labor markets, firms become demanders of labor and individuals become suppliers of labor. And another thing that changes, of course, is that we're going to have some different notation. We're just going to use an L down here for labor. This is a quantity, just as it has been before. So this is quantity of labor, and that could be in the form of workers or worker hours or something like that. Up here on the vertical axis, we're going to put the price of labor, which of course is just the wage. And for now, we're going to ignore the fact that there can be different kinds of workers earning different wages, of course. We're just going to think about kind of a big pool of workers that are all more or less the same with regards to their skills and things like that. And in this market, then, there's going to be some demand, and it's going to follow the law of demand. I don't know exactly how steep or how flat it will be, but some demand for labor. And again, this demand for labor is derived from the demand for goods. And so the more individuals want to buy the goods and services that this particular firm is selling, the more labor that firm will demand. And at the same time, on the other side, are you and I in the form of workers. And as workers, we supply our labor to the market. And you'll notice that as wages go up, we've drawn the labor supply curve, right? So as wages go up, we move up this way. We've drawn the labor supply curve with a positive slope, which indicates that the amount of labor that people want to provide to the labor market is increasing as well. So it's an increasing function of the wage. Now there is an argument, I'll just draw another quick little picture up here in the corner. There is an argument for the possibility that the labor supply curve might actually have a little bit more curvature to it. So if this is the wage and this is labor, you can tell a story, especially at higher wages, where the labor supply curve actually comes up and then perhaps starts to bend back a little bit. The argument here would be that, look, when I'm earning low wages, definitely it's the case that when my wage goes up, I want to work more. But if my wage gets high enough, I may actually decide that I want to work a little bit less. I'm making enough money to have a comfortable lifestyle, and what I really value is time. And so when my wage gets nice and high, then I might actually decide to work fewer hours. And that certainly is a possibility, and it could potentially impact things for certainly a big chunk of workers. I would say that's not true, and we'll think about modeling those workers here in our original picture. But do be aware that that backward bending labor supply curve is certainly a possibility. So back to my original picture now, of course, there's going to be some interaction, some equilibrium that's established in the labor market where there's going to be a wage and a quantity of workers that are going to, or quantity of hours, if you want to think about it that way. So I'm just going to call that equilibrium wage W star, the equilibrium number of hours worked or number of workers, I'm going to call L star. And one of the things that is, of course, interesting about labor markets is that oftentimes individuals aren't terribly happy with the wage that they pay. And so we may run into situations where it becomes a political issue for governments to step in and perhaps do something about the wage that is likely to exist in an unconstrained and uninterrupted labor market. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this situation where governments may be pressured to step into the labor market and interfere with the free market outcome. And the most likely scenario in which this is going to happen, of course, is a case where workers feel that they're underpaid by some standard, or a situation where a policymaker decides that they want to try and ensure some kind of basic level of wage security. Now, there's been lots and lots of back and forth politically about the issue of the minimum wage. Here in Washington State, we have a system where the minimum wage is tied to inflation. We actually have the highest minimum wage in the country. The concern that exists, I'm going to draw two different pictures here. The concern that exists over the minimum wage is that if you set some kind of price floor, which is essentially what a minimum wage is going to do, we know from past conversations that we've had that that price floor is going to act to create a disequilibrium situation. And we'll talk about exactly what kind of disequilibrium is likely to arise in this circumstance here in a second. But the reason that I want to draw two different pictures is that the degree to which this disequilibrium is a problem depends a lot on what you think is true in the labor market. So I'm going to draw in blue here a labor market over on the left where the labor demand curve and the labor supply curve are quite steep, quite inelastic. So there's supply of labor, there's demand of labor over here in the left-hand picture. In the right one in green, I'm going to draw a case where the demand for labor and the supply of labor are both quite elastic, quite flat. It's going to look something like that. And actually, hold on, let's go. I'm going to go back just a second if you don't mind. Okay. Thing I wanted to do, so demand of labor over here, is that I want to show this market on this side as having sort of the same starting wage. So I'm going to put supply way down here. So supply of labor and demand for labor. Okay, looks like that. So initially, these two labor markets, or two versions of the labor market, are in equilibrium with a little bit of artistic license as I go across here, at the same wage, right? And say roughly the same quantity. The quantity effect isn't quite what we care about, at least not the initial quantity. Now suppose that in both cases a policy is put in place to impose a minimum wage. So let's do the minimum wage, maybe in purple. And let's say that the minimum wage is going to be set right there at that level. And over in this picture, that looks like it's roughly right about there. So that's the minimum wage. And what happens is that the market, of course, as is the case with any price floor, the minimum wage stops the wage from going to the equilibrium value because it prohibits wages lower than that, and it requires that the wage be at least at this purple line. Now, if I look over here in my mark on the left, say, well, is this a problem or not? Well, in both cases, when the minimum wage is imposed, we know that it's going to create, I don't want to mess up my picture too much, but it's going to create a disequilibrium. In both cases, it's going to drive the wage above the prevailing market wage, and it's going to create a situation where the labor supply, the quantity of labor supplied, exceeds the quantity of labor demanded. And one way that we can think about that situation, where there's more workers that want to work or more hours that they want to work than are actually available and actually demanded by employers, is that it creates unemployment. So I don't think there's too much debate over the fact that if a labor market's initially in equilibrium, that adding a minimum wage will create unemployment. Where the debate comes in, the political debate comes in, is in the matter of degree. So over here in the market on the right with the green, very elastic labor supply and labor demand curve, the total amount of unemployment created is that gap between those two red dots, between the quantity of labor supply and the quantity of labor demand. Now, some of those unemployed workers or unemployed hours were individuals that would not have wanted to work. They're right here, would not have wanted to work at the original market wage, that do want to work now at the minimum wage. So should we care? But we probably should care about them to some degree. I'm probably more concerned from a policy perspective, though, about these workers back here who were working before, because the eventual outcome in this market, once the minimum wage is put in place, is going to be a pretty sizable decrease in the number of workers actually employed. So we get total unemployment between these two red dots, but this arrow is showing the amount of reduction in employment that we get when the minimum wage is put in place. If we do the same thing over here, right, here's the total on the one with the steeper curves. There's the total amount of unemployment created. I'm not sure I've drawn these so steep, I don't know if I can even show it. Something like that. And a very small change in the number of workers employed. So whether or not you think adding a minimum wage or raising the minimum wage, this is applied to a change as well, is a good idea or not, depends in part, and there's some political and possibly even humanitarian reasons to feel otherwise, but depends in part to whether or not you think the world looks like it does on the left with relatively steep labor supply and demand curves, quite inelastic, or whether you think the world looks like something on the right. Now ultimately that of course is an empirical question, and one that we can answer by doing some estimation of the shapes of these curves. There probably is no single answer, of course. It probably is the case that a lot of labor supply and demand curves have steep sections and flatter sections, and so we need to know not just what is the general shape, but where are we on those particular curves. So hopefully that gives you an idea of some of the issues that come up in labor markets and some of the new terminology that we employ in these cases. By and large, basic supply and demand kind of analysis, but just with some different labels and some important political and social implications as well. That's it for today. Thanks.